The key to a good outline, especially for the first draft of your first book, is to keep it simple. There's a temptation to get bogged down in detail or world building when you're outlining a story. But remember that the outline itself is just a rough guide to help you follow the path while writing. It's like scaffolding to help you paint a house, but it's not the actual painting itself. So remember our guiding mantra as you move into the outlining phase of your book. Progress, not perfection. The aim with your first book is to get it done, not for it to be perfect. Having said that, for your first novel, it's a good idea to be a little bit more detailed with an outline, because this is the map that you'll be following as you write your book. The more points you can flesh out before you start writing, the easier it will be to keep momentum going throughout the writing process. Now, you may not know your writing preference at this stage, but most writers fall into one of two categories. Those that like to plan meticulously and produce an extensive draft before they start the writing process, and those that prefer to start with only a very loose outline and then wing it. Myself, I fall firmly in the latter category. Part of the joy of writing for me is the thrill of discovery, so I typically start a novel with only a very basic outline and no idea how I'm going to end the novel. Again though, if this is your first novel, I'd suggest leaning a little more toward writing a detailed outline, even if you're more of a flying by the seat of your pants style person. Now, I haven't mentioned genre yet because I didn't want to dig into the commercial realities of writing just yet, particularly if your first novel is just something that you're doing for the experience itself. If you're doing this because you always wanted to write a novel and you're not fussed about who will read it, then go for it. Ignore genre, write whatever you feel, and have a bucket load of fun along the way. If, however, you actually want to work as a writer or sell your novels, then it's worth taking some time early on to think about genre. Because if you write a novel that can be placed in a clear genre, it's going to be much easier to market and sell your book. As a writer, you'll need to strike a balance between your own creative journey and what you want to write and the commercial realities of what it actually means to be a writer. Certain genres will sell better than others. Certain tropes will work well within those given genres. And while writing a completely original, genre-bending masterpiece might be exactly what you want to do, that can be a very difficult thing to sell for one important reason. Readers buy what they recognize. If a reader can't understand what genre your novel is and they can't get a good feel for the kind of story you're telling, they're not likely to buy it. It's as simple as that. Now, I'll cover this in more detail in later videos, but for now, if writing is something that you're thinking of doing in at least a semi-professional capacity, being able to land on a clear genre and including the kinds of tropes common to that genre will be a good idea. There's a temptation to think that all writing needs to be unique to be great. New writers can sometimes twist themselves in knots, trying to avoid leaning on any commonly used tropes, or out of a fear that some of their ideas might be identified too clearly with well-known authors. So let me put your mind at ease. You don't have to be 100% original to be a great writer. In fact, in many ways, being completely original will also make your book much harder to market and sell to readers. As I mentioned earlier, if readers don't recognize your book as something that they're likely to read, then you're fighting an uphill battle to get them to pick it up in the first place. Originality is great, and there are plenty of ways that you can be original in how you approach your writing. But it also typically takes years for writers to find their writing voice and fit into a rhythm of writing which works well for them. This is your first book, so don't stress so much about originality or trying to break new ground. Now, that doesn't mean you should be copying well-known books or plagiarizing from other authors, but there's a big difference between stealing ideas and being inspired by other creative people. No matter what you write, your book will be inspired by the influences you've been exposed to. Writers that you love, films and TV shows that you've watched for years, music, even loved ones and friends. This is all part of the writing process and something that you should embrace rather than fear. But for those of you that are convinced that you're going to produce an original masterpiece, invent a new genre, and change the publishing industry forever with your first book, well, go for it. Maybe you're right. And who am I to stand in your way? Now, on to the outline. Your first step is to plot out the main points of your story, the key moments of change, conflict, decision, and action. These might be world events, psychological struggles, blatant conflicts, intrigues, anything that moves your story forward in a clear way. These are the big bones of your story, the main structural points on which your book progresses. Using my previous example of an upcoming book I'm tentatively calling The Third Sister. Yeah, I know, not great, but it's a working title and I need something to call it other than the book. So we're sticking with that for the moment, but we'll see. Anyway, here are some of the main points of that story. Introduce Jane and her life with dissociative identity disorder and her relationship with Nate. A birthday party where we see the stresses and struggles relating to Jane's situation. Nate, Jane's husband, reveals that he's working on a homicide where a female assassin is killing off powerful people throughout the city. Eleanor, Jane's alter ego, takes over and retreats into her art studio, while Nate is under increasing pressure at work. Jane wakes to find two messages on her answering machine, one from Elena and another from a mysterious woman, the third sister. sister, who leaves an enigmatic warning. Jane doesn't tell Nate and deletes the message straight away. Okay, so I won't continue here, but that gives you some idea of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. I'll leave more details in the comments so that you can see how I might start to step out the key points in my story. Now that you've got some of the big bones of your story mapped out, you can start to look at the overall movement of your novel and start thinking about how it will feel to your reader. This is the point where you might want to rearrange some of the key plot points. Bring forward action sequences to keep the reading interesting, or push off a climax a little to give the reader more time to get invested in the story. You might look at your big bones and realize that everything is moving far too quickly. Readers won't be able to keep up, so you'll need to add in some new plot points to develop your characters and slow things down a little. Conversely, you might find that your story is already starting to drag. Now's a great time to start tightening up the book, removing anything that doesn't add to the story and doesn't drive your narrative forward. Now, at this stage, you'll only have a partial story, the big bones, without any real meat or intricacy. And that's fine. That's the perfect time to rearrange key components of your story so that the whole narrative makes more sense to readers. Some things to consider at this stage include the pacing of your story. Is it too fast, too slow? Do your characters have enough time to develop? Do the big reveals and twists make sense where they're located? Does your story logically lead from one point to another and then to the conclusion of the novel? Are there some plot points that don't really add anything to the story? And if so, maybe remove them. Are there any notable gaps in the story, things that are missing which would make it hard for readers to follow? At each stage throughout the writing process, there'll be an opportunity to shift things up, to rearrange your story, add new scenes, or remove sections of the story that just don't add anything to the overall trajectory of your novel. It's important each time that you make changes to your book structure that you think about the reader experience. That should be the driving factor behind any changes that you make. Ask yourself, how do you want your readers to feel at a certain point in the narrative? What questions do you want them to be asking? What conclusions do you want them to be reaching for? While it's true that writing is as much for the writer as it is for the reader, the ultimate goal here is to produce a novel which will be read by people. So one of the skills that you're going to need to develop in your writing is being able to see your story from the reader's perspective. That will help you remove any extraneous details that just don't add anything, tighten up your pacing, deepen your characters, and ultimately make your novel that much more enjoyable to readers. Now that you've got a very rough outline, you've spent some time shaping and changing the basic structure of your book, it's time to dig into the detail. Start expanding each of the main points that you've listed in your outline and think about the book scene by scene. You can add dot points, sentences, even add snatches of dialogue if it helps you flesh out the ideas. The goal here is to expand your outline into a detailed plan, which will end up being anything from 2 pages to a dozen or even more, depending on your novel, writing style, and how detailed you want to be. This outlining process is going to take some time, and you'll need to think clearly through plot points, character details, and so on. The more time you spend agonizing over the structure, pacing, and overall flow of your novel at this point, the easier it will be when it comes to the actual writing. Now, if you're not a big planner, then a lot of that heavy lifting will be done later on during the writing, and that might suit your personality style. But again, this is your first novel, so I'd lean towards being as detailed as possible with your outline and working through as many of these structural issues as you can before you start writing. Here's an example of how I might expand on one of my big bones plot points from The Third Sister. Point number 1, introduce Jane and her life with dissociative identity disorder and her relationship with Nate. Jane wakes up sitting in a small art studio, holding a paintbrush and staring at a partially filled canvas. Unsettled, she puts down the brush, heads out of the studio and walks to a small table in another room, where an old answering machine sits blinking with one message. Jane presses the button and hears a version of her own voice, Eleanor's voice, recounting her frustration because a renowned gallery refuses to display her artwork. You can see from this example that a single plot point can expand naturally into 1 or 2 scenes. When I write these out in the book itself, they might end up as 3 or 4 pages of text, depending on how I decide to write it. One more thing to consider as you start working through your outline is the arc or journey of each of your main characters, and even your villains. The book itself should progress through a beginning, middle, and end, and should reach a conclusion which is satisfying to the reader, but also hopefully surprising and thrilling. But your protagonist should go through exactly the same kind of journey, as should each of your main characters. This isn't something to agonize over at this point, but it's worth taking some time during the outlining phase of your writing to write out the story arcs of your main characters and make sure that they each follow their own individual story arc, and that key components of those arcs aren't left hanging. Unless, of course, it's by design. As always, leave comments and questions below, like, subscribe, and most importantly, get writing.